The afternoon light in Austin hung thick, like honey, brushing every surface of the shelter's western wing in a golden haze. It wasn't a warm light. It was too still, too heavy, as if it had paused mid-air and didn't know how to move forward. The dogs barked down the hallway, sharp, anxious sounds ricocheting off metal bars. But at the far end, there was only silence. Grace Carter moved with practiced ease. 3 years volunteering at the Austin Animal Rescue had made her fluent in heartbreak, fluent in the way dogs flinched at raised hands, or how they clung with desperate eyes when someone walked by. And yet, today felt different. Her steps slowed without reason, not because of exhaustion or noise, but something quieter, a pull. "Grace," Sarah's voice called gently from ahead, not urgent, but laced with something unexpected, emotion. "You need to see the new one." She turned the corner. Her breath caught before her mind could name why. There, sitting in the farthest kennel, was a German Shepherd mix. Strong frame, short coat streaked with aged brown and black like worn mahogany. But it wasn't her size or breed that made Grace stop. It was her stillness, her posture, and most of all, her eyes. They weren't scared. They weren't eager. They were waiting. The dog sat tall, unmoving, with a gaze that didn't dart or plead. Her eyes, ambered and dulled, looked through the fencing, past people and time, as if searching for something only she could still remember. She didn't bark. She didn't flinch. She simply waited, wrapped in a silence that hummed like a hymn. Grace stepped closer. The tag on the kennel door read just one name, Zoo. She crouched, letting her hand rest against the fence's cold wire. "Hey, sweet girl," she whispered. Her voice dropped, softened by instinct. Zoo didn't move, but her ears flicked. Then, after a long stillness, Zoo leaned forward, not a leap, not a lunge, just a single step, and touched her nose to Grace's fingers through the wire. No tail wag, no sound, just a brush of breath and fur that lasted less than a second. But in that second, something shifted. Grace felt it, like something old being remembered. Zoo had the kind of presence that didn't ask for anything. She simply reminded you that something once precious had been lost, and maybe, just maybe, she was still waiting for it to return. Grace didn't rise. She stayed crouched by the fence, watching Zoo as if afraid to break whatever thread had just been spun between them. Around her, the shelter continued on, doors opening, dogs barking, a phone ringing at the front desk. But inside that narrow hallway, with rusted cages and cracked tiles underfoot, time had stilled. Zoo didn't lean back. She didn't retreat. But she also didn't push forward. She stayed right there, her nose hovering near Grace's fingers, eyes unreadable. Not pleading, not trusting, something stranger, something deeper, as if she were studying Grace not for answers, but for memory. "She jumped into someone's yard last night," Sarah said quietly, coming up beside her. No chip, no collar. They said she looked sad, not scared, not aggressive, just like she didn't know where else to go. Grace turned to look back at Zoo. "She doesn't look lost." "No," Sarah agreed. "She looks like she's been left." That hit Grace in the chest, sharp and unexpected. She looked again. Really looked. Zoo sat with a kind of poised dignity, her back straight, her paws tucked neatly beneath her. She wasn't slouched like the dogs that had given up. She wasn't frantic like those still hoping. She looked, paused, like someone still waiting at the train station, long after the train had gone. The only thing in the kennel with her was a single object, an old pale blue cloth folded carefully in the corner. It was clean, despite the dust around it, positioned as if someone had taken the time to lay it down before saying goodbye. Grace's gaze lingered on it. Strays don't have belongings, but this one, this dog, had something she guarded. Zoo, Grace said softly, more to herself than to the dog. You weren't dropped off. You were left behind. Zoo blinked, slowly, and in that blink, Grace didn't see an animal reacting to her voice. She saw a creature holding on to the last sliver of a memory, carefully, painfully, afraid that letting it go would mean becoming nothing at all. She stayed there a while longer, hand still at the fence, breathing slowly until Zoo's ears twitched again. Then, with the kind of stillness that meant everything, Zoo laid down, not with fear or submission, but with a tired grace. Her body curled, chin resting on her paws, eyes never leaving Grace's, and Grace whispered, barely above breath, I see you. Grace returned to the kennel the next morning before her shift began. The shelter lights buzzed above her, casting a bluish tint over the concrete floor, but the hallway felt quieter than usual, less like a place and more like a memory. She carried a small notebook in one hand, unsure why. Maybe she wanted to write something down. Maybe she wanted to remember. Zoo hadn't moved much. She was in the same position, paws crossed, head up, as if she'd been holding vigil through the night. Her water bowl was full, her food untouched. Hi again, Grace said gently, kneeling in front of the fence. Did you sleep at all? Zoo didn't answer, of course, but she lifted her head slightly, ears tilting just enough to acknowledge the voice. Grace took that as something, a shift in the air, a crack in the wall. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a single treat, not tossed, not offered with fanfare. She placed it gently between the fence bars and withdrew her hand, letting silence speak instead. Zoo stared at it, unmoving. A full minute passed, then another, and just when Grace began to wonder if she'd misread everything, Zoo stretched her neck forward, took the treat without sound, and retreated again, silent as breath. It wasn't hunger. It was trust, earned, not given. Grace exhaled slowly. Okay, she whispered, a tremor in her voice. Okay. She pulled out her notebook and wrote only one sentence. Day 1. She let me feed her. It didn't feel like much, but in the world of wounded creatures and cautious hearts, it was everything. Because Zoo hadn't looked at her with desperation or fear. She had looked at her with choice, and that kind of connection, the slow, uncertain kind, was the beginning of something Grace hadn't felt in a long time. Later that day, while other dogs barked and leapt for attention, Zoo remained still, watchful, but calm. Grace returned during her lunch break, bringing a soft fleece blanket, folded under one arm. It smelled faintly of lavender detergent, a scent the shelter used in the laundry room. She didn't know if Zoo would care, but part of her hoped it might feel like something kind. As she knelt beside the kennel again, Grace unfolded the blanket slowly, not making a sound. She slid it under the gate, letting it settle beside the pale blue cloth already in Zoo's corner. Zoo didn't move, but her eyes shifted. One long look at the new object, then at Grace, as if comparing the two. There, Grace said, her voice almost fragile. Something softer. You deserve that. Zoo didn't come forward, didn't wag her tail, but she didn't look away either, and that was something. Sarah passed by behind her and paused. You're really drawn to her, huh? Grace didn't turn. She doesn't act like the others. Because she's not, Sarah replied. She's waiting. You can feel it. Grace nodded slowly. She's not trying to be saved. She's just holding on. There was a moment of silence between them, thick with unspoken understanding. Then Sarah added, "She hasn't looked at anyone like she looks at you." Grace turned back toward Zoo, who was now shifting slightly, her paw brushing the edge of the new blanket. "She reminds me of someone who's lived a whole life," Grace murmured, "and now she's just sitting in the last page." Zoo finally moved. Not much, just enough to reposition herself so her side rested on the blanket. And then, almost imperceptibly, she sighed. A long, quiet exhale from deep inside her chest. Not fear, not submission, relief. The days that followed unfolded like whispers, quiet, delicate, and slow. Grace made it a ritual. Each morning before the doors opened, she walked the long corridor of kennels with a coffee in one hand and Zoo's name written softly in her thoughts. Some days she brought a fresh blanket. Others, she just sat. No commands, no gestures, just presence. Zoo never barked. She never leapt or begged for treats. But when Grace arrived, she always lifted her head. Not quickly, not with excitement, but with recognition. That alone felt sacred. One afternoon, a volunteer tossed a squeaky toy into the aisle, one of those bright red plastic ones shaped like a bone. Most of the dogs lunged at it. Zoo didn't. She stared. But Grace noticed the way her body stilled, the way her gaze followed the toy as it rolled past. And later, when the hallway cleared out and noise subsided, she caught Zoo inching closer to the edge of her kennel, her eyes fixed on a forgotten yellow rubber bone someone had left near the drain. Zoo didn't touch it. She just looked. Grace made a note in her journal. She sat perfectly still and stared at that toy for 15 minutes. Didn't blink, didn't flinch, like she was watching something sacred. That night, Grace couldn't sleep. She kept thinking about that toy, the way Zoo's entire posture had changed. It wasn't playfulness, it was memory. The next morning, she pulled up Zoo's intake photo again, and there, in the far corner of the field where she was first found, nestled in the dry leaves, was the same yellow toy. A rubber bone, faded by sun and time, one end frayed. Zoo hadn't been wandering aimlessly. She'd been near it, guarding it. Grace whispered aloud to no one. That toy meant something. And suddenly, it all clicked. That evening, as dusk softened the sky, Grace printed the field photo. The one with the yellow toy and Zoo in the background, sitting motionless like a statue of loyalty. She slid the photo into her coat pocket and made her way through the dim hallway, where the dogs had begun to quiet with nightfall. Zoo was awake, still, as if she hadn't moved in hours. Grace knelt again, her hands gentle, voice softer than the hum of the vents. "I brought something," she said, sliding the photo through the gap at the bottom of the fence. Zoo didn't react at first. Her eyes remained trained on Grace, but then she turned, slow, deliberate, and looked down at the image. Something shifted in her shoulders, not visible to most, but Grace saw it. Zoo lowered her head slightly, her nose almost brushing the photo. She didn't lick it, didn't paw at it. But her eyes, those ancient amber eyes, deepened. And then, as if pulled by something unseen, she pressed her forehead against the bars, directly above the paper. It wasn't a gesture of affection. It was a communion. Grace's breath caught. "That was his, wasn't it?" she whispered. "Rex." Zoo closed her eyes. Not all the way, just enough to soften the edges. Her body didn't tense, her ears relaxed, and for the first time her weight leaned ever so slightly toward Grace's side of the fence. Not a leap of faith, just a shift in gravity. Grace stayed frozen. She didn't dare reach out. Zoo had chosen closeness on her own, and that mattered more than anything. Some dogs wag their tails when they feel safe. Zoo pressed her head into silence, and in that stillness, Grace felt something ancient stir, a recognition that love, when buried deep enough, never dies. It waits. The following morning, Grace drove with intention, not toward the shelter, but through winding streets guided by a message from a stranger. Margaret Dawson had commented on Zoo's photo. "I used to see that dog. She belonged to a little girl, always reading on the lawn. The dog never left her side." The address she gave was on Maple Street. Grace found the house easily. It wasn't grand or new, just a blue home with faded shingles and a porch softened by time. The yard was overgrown, the windows shuttered, but something about it felt held together, like an old lullaby, waiting to be heard again. She stepped out of her car and walked to the gate. There, nailed into one of the porch beams, hung a rusted collar hook, shaped like a fishbone, decorative once, now forgotten, and yet still present. Grace ran her fingers across the wood. This had been Zoo's home. The elderly neighbor appeared beside her with a gentle voice. She was called Zuzu. She followed their old dog, Rex, everywhere. The little girl, Sophie. She used to sing to them on that porch. Grace barely breathed. What happened? Rex passed. The family lost the house. The girl's father lost his job. They had to move. No pets allowed. They left Zuzu with a neighbor temporarily, but the dog ran away, came straight back here, sat outside for hours, days even, waiting. Grace's throat closed. The note from Zoo's intake form echoed in her mind. Jumped into yard. Owner unknown. She wasn't wandering. She was returning. Not to find food, not to find safety, but to find someone. Grace looked around the yard, at the chipped fence, the overturned water bowl, the patch of earth where a dog once lay under a summer sky. Then she placed her hand against the porch step and whispered, "I found your home, Zoo. And if I can't bring you back here, I promise, I'll bring back the part that made it feel like home." A breeze moved through the trees. The collar hook swayed gently, and in that sound, Grace heard the ache of something lost and the promise of something not yet gone. Back at the shelter, Zoo sat in her usual place, upright, quiet, eyes fixed down the corridor, as if nothing in the world had changed. But everything had. Grace moved slowly, clutching a folded note. The neighbor had handed it to her before she left the blue house. Inside, an address, an apartment on the east side of the city. No lawn, no porch, no dogs allowed. It was Sophie's new home. That night, Grace didn't sleep. She stared at the address, reread the intake notes, then pulled up Zoo's intake photos again. There it was, clearer than ever. In one image, Zoo sat still in the yard, eyes locked, not on the camera, but on the yellow toy in the grass. A rubber bone, chewed, frayed, faded by time. She hadn't touched it, hadn't moved toward it, just stared, as if waiting for something that would never return. Grace whispered aloud to the silence of her room. She was mourning. She understood now. That toy, it wasn't just a thing. It was Rex. It was Sophie. It was summer afternoons, porches, and the whisper of a child who once believed promises didn't break. And Zoo? Zoo hadn't forgotten. She had carried that memory across fences and blocks and months of loneliness, not in her teeth, in her soul. Grace stood from her desk, grabbed the printed photo, and drove to the shelter. It was nearly 2 a.m. The hallway was silent except for the soft sigh of sleeping dogs, but Zoo was awake, still, watching, always. Grace didn't speak. She sat, slowly slid the photo through the bars. Zoo didn't sniff it this time. She just looked, and then, quietly, pressed her head to the metal again, in the same place she had before. Not to see, to feel. A soft breath escaped her, not a whimper, a memory, loosening. And Grace knew. Zoo hadn't stayed behind out of confusion. She stayed behind for love. The next day, Grace stood in front of a worn apartment door on the 3rd floor. Pale white walls, a view of a gas station, no porch, no shade. It was a far cry from the blue house on Maple Street. Her fingers trembled as she knocked. A woman answered, thin, exhausted, wrapped in a worn coat. She looked like someone who had carried too much for too long. Behind her, the apartment smelled faintly of tea and laundry soap. "I'm Grace," she said softly, "from the rescue center. I think I'm caring for a dog who used to belong to your family." The woman's eyes widened, then dropped into something heavier. "Zuzu," she breathed. Grace nodded. The woman let her in without a word. In the corner sat a girl, silent, still, no longer the carefree child described by neighbors. She clutched an old book, gaze unfocused. "Sophie," the woman said gently, "this is Grace. She knows where Zuzu is." The girl's fingers froze around the pages. She didn't look up, but Grace saw it. The subtle rise in her shoulders, the pause of breath, the flicker. The mother sat, her voice cracking. "We didn't have a choice. My husband lost his job. I had to stop working after the accident. The apartment wouldn't allow pets. We left Zuzu with a neighbor, just for a little while, but she ran, went back home." Sophie turned slightly, still no words, just silence. Grace spoke softly, as if to both of them. "She never left you. She waited at the house, at the gate. She didn't eat. She didn't sleep. She just stared at that old yellow toy, like she was listening for a voice only she could hear." Sophie blinked, slowly. Then she spoke, for the first time. "Did she wait for me?" Grace swallowed. She never stopped. And in that moment, Sophie stood, not fast, not dramatic. She simply stood, because some hearts remember even in silence, and because some promises don't fade, even when the world moves on. The next morning, the rescue center felt different, lighter, like the building itself was holding its breath. Grace arrived early, skipping her usual coffee, skipping the routine that had once steadied her. She headed straight for Zoo's kennel. The dog was already awake. She stood slowly, not with excitement, but with the steady grace of someone who sensed that today might mean something. At 9:50 a.m., the front door creaked open. Rachel, Sophie's mother, stepped inside, her lilac scarf wound tight around her fingers. She came alone. Grace nodded, silently leading her to the outdoor courtyard. It was a small, quiet space where Zoo had always felt safer than inside, where sunlight fell evenly across the cement, where birds sometimes perched on the shelter's fence and sang without fear. Rachel stood still. Her eyes searched the space like she was trying to measure her own heart. Grace unclipped Zoo's leash and stepped back. No commands, no encouragement, just choice. Zoo stood still at first. She looked at Rachel, not with confusion, but with quiet recognition, like someone remembering a dream they'd once loved. Then, slowly, she stepped forward. One step, then another. Rachel knelt, hands open, palms up, a tremble moving through her fingers. Zoo paused inches away, ears soft, eyes steady. Then she did what she hadn't done for anyone else since arriving. She pressed her head into the woman's chest and closed her eyes. Rachel's breath broke. Her hands curled gently around the dog's shoulders, and for the first time in months, she cried. Not from pain, from remembering, from healing, from a connection that didn't need words. Inside the building, Sophie watched from the hallway, face pressed to the glass. Her hand slowly rose. It rested against the window. Zhu turned and looked. Grace stood behind Sophie in the quiet hallway. She didn't say anything, just watched as the girl kept her hand pressed to the glass, her breath fogging a small circle that pulsed with every slow exhale. Zhu didn't move right away. She simply held Rachel a moment longer, then stepped back, her gaze lifting toward the window. Their eyes met, and for a moment, the world held its breath. Sophie opened the door. She didn't run, didn't cry. She walked with the careful weight of someone returning to something sacred. Zhu didn't wag her tail. She didn't leap or bark. She stepped forward, calm, certain, and stopped just in front of her. Sophie knelt. Her hands trembled as she reached out, but she didn't have to touch. Zhu closed the space between them. She leaned forward and rested her forehead against the girl's chest, just like she had done all those nights on the porch, in the rain, under blankets, on the steps. A soft, broken whisper fell from Sophie's lips. "You found me." Zhu didn't answer. She didn't have to. Her body said it all, ears soft, eyes lowered, breath steady. She had waited, through storms, through fences, through the ache of being forgotten. But she was never lost. She had always been on her way back. And now, at last, the wait was over. The paperwork was quick, quieter than Grace expected. No one raised their voice. No one rushed. The shelter had made an exception, because some stories weren't about adoption. They were about reunion. Zhu's name stayed the same on the file, but Grace added a note in the margin. Also answers to Zuzu. Next to it, she wrote only one word: returned. When Rachel and Sophie left that afternoon, Zhu walked beside them, not pulled, not guided, just there, shoulder to knee, step for step, like she had never left their side. Grace stood by the door, watching them disappear into the soft gold of early evening light. A breeze picked up. Somewhere, a collar tag clinked against itself. She turned, walking back through the hallway, where the walls still echoed with longing. And yet, today, it felt different, like something old had closed gently, without pain. On her desk, she opened her notebook and wrote, "She waited, and they came." Then she added beneath it, "Some dogs aren't lost. They're just remembering where to be found." Outside, the sky turned lavender. On a quiet porch somewhere, in a house grown old with time, a yellow toy still lay in the grass. Not forgotten, not replaced, but finally at peace. Because Zuzu, was no longer watching through fences or dreaming in silence. She was home.